This is the YouTube version of the Hidden Experience audio podcast. This show is hosted by Mike Cleland, and that's me, and it is available on most of the popular podcast platforms. Just search out Hidden Experience Audio. And if you want to support the show, you can find it on Patreon, as well as Buy Me a Coffee. This YouTube version has ads, but the audio version is always ad-free. And you can also join my YouTube channel here. And now the show. Audio conversation with David Metcalfe, recorded Wednesday, May 15th, 2025. Now, I am recording this little introduction at the end after doing the interview and completing the editing, and I realized I did not have a bio for David. I actually don't know much about what he does. So I sent him a note and I said, "Hey, David, can you send me a bio?" And he got right back to me and he kind of went, "Ugh." And I could tell he didn't have anything handy or ready. And then I sent him a note and said, "You know, what I want to do is just say, he's that guy that I've always heard about, but I've never talked with him." And he got back to me right away and said, "Ooh, I like that." And so that's what I'm going to do. So David Metcalfe is that guy that I've always heard about, but I have never talked with him. Now, let me back that up a little bit. I have talked with him briefly because I met him at a conference back in 2022, and we addressed that right at the beginning of this conversation. This conversation lasted about an hour and a half, just a little more than that. And during our time in conversation, you'll hear David talk about plenty of the things that he's done in this field. And we covered a lot. And at the same time, wow, there was so much more that we could have talked about, but we simply never got to it. So I foresee a day when David will be back and we can address the things that we never got to in this interview. Now, before I begin the formal interview, I just want to address a few things that are new for this podcast series. One, I now use Patreon as a platform for members. As of today, which is the middle of May 2025, I don't really have much to offer the Patreon members. I will put some stuff up on the site very soon, but my first priority was to get some content on the site, to get a handful of interviews on the site. This interview with David is my fourth in the series of interviews. Two, I am also using a platform called Buy Me a Coffee, and you can find me by searching Buy Me a Coffee, Mike Cleland, and I should come right up. And these are both ways that you can offer some support for the work I do on this show. And one of the things that I really try to do a good job and create a quality podcast. And just so you know, I do edit heavily. I want the conversation to feel streamlined and clear and punchy. And I do all that work, all that hard work, because I really and truly care about the experience of the listener. And I mean that. I really care. I want this show to sound really clear and really strong. So please, if you can, your support would help me enormously, either through the Patreon site or through Buy Me a Coffee. And I am using those platforms because I do not want to put any advertisements on my podcasts. I feel very strongly about that. Okay, now, having just said that, I will do a little self-promotion, some self-advertising. If you like my show, please buy my books. I have 4 books out. I am very proud of all 4. You can find them very easily on Amazon. Okay, the commercial's over. And now, let's move on to the interview with David Metcalfe. This was a marvelous, wonderful conversation. Please enjoy. David, I want to thank you so much for saying yes to this interview. It means a lot to me.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. We've been kind of paralleling each other for quite a long time, so it's nice to finally be able to sit down and have a talk.
Well, we got to sit down 2 years ago together at the Rice Conference at Rice University.
Yeah.
The Archives of the Impossible Conference, which was run by Jeffrey Kripal. And there was a morning where you and I had breakfast with Jacques Vallée.
Yeah.
How was that for you?
I have a joke with Greg Bishop that one of the things I would really like to see is kind of one of those Travel Channel shows where you have somebody on there, a celebrity or something but you're not doing the things that they're associated with, right? So it would be like going golfing with Whitley Strieber, and that would be the experience. And I think that breakfast with Valet, the thing that I remember most is him eating that breakfast pastry. And that to me was a highlight of the conference, being able to sit there, at points just kind of sitting there quietly while Valet enjoys his breakfast pastry. I was like, this, if nothing else comes of anything, this is it. This is a beautiful moment that I can cherish, and I can leave all the rest of it behind and just have that moment with Valet eating a breakfast pastry, and that would be, that's it.
There was a point where he basically said, "Oh, I'm on this phone call. It's something where I got to meet with some lawyer, and these people are on a boat or something."
Yeah.
And it was kind of like, "Oh, well, I'll just be quiet." And then but it was funny because it wasn't just a pastry; it was a croissant. It was like a French croissant,
it sure was.
And he was in Texas. I have to think that like this guy has probably spent time in some of the most elegant patisseries in Paris, and here he is eating a Texas croissant.
Yeah, one of those hotel ones too. It's like straight out of the refrigerator, kind of reheated croissant.
Yeah,
and that was interesting too. That he was making calls from his real life persona as a venture capitalist, and so he's there making like international deals and stuff like that on the phone, eating a pastry, and we're at the Archive of the Impossible.
Yeah.
Conference. It was good stuff. That was a beautiful moment.
And I don't think it was right there at the breakfast table, but I think it was standing at some point. He knew about the owl book, and he remembered. So, but actually, he did not remember. He told me a story that he had sent me in a letter.
Oh, okay.
And as a researcher, you must get this where someone will tell you the same story again. And I just let him tell it.
Yep.
I'm like, did I remember this correctly? Because I know how I wrote it.
Yeah,
But it's your story. And it wasn't actually his story. It was from his files. It was a story that he researched. Right. It wasn't his direct experience. It was people he interviewed. And there's a point where I very clearly say it came from Jacques Vallée in the book, where he had a story of an owl in France. And there were two people in a car. And there was a hovering flying saucer like near the road. And an owl just dropped out of the sky and went plop and then flopped around on the pavement in front of the car. It turns out he said they were gendarmes, so it was a police car or a police car came to, but that my sense was that was a police car. But he never said that in the initial go through. But it's a case from a long time ago. I'm not worried about anything there. But his impression was that the UFO, this flying saucer, this craft, had somehow disoriented basically the flight capabilities of this owl, and it could no longer fly, and it just fell and it was flopping around in the road. So in my book, that opened up a lot of speculation on like, what is the UFO doing, and why does the owl seem to be attracted to it? And that was early on in the book, and that chapter is all real interesting, but it doesn't really fit the bigger picture of what's going on in the research. But it was interesting to hear him tell that story that he had written to me before. I said, "Can you give me the files to this?" And he basically said, "Oh my word, my files, it's locked away somewhere. Yeah. I'll never be able to find it." So, which I understand that all too well at this point. So
soon, though, I mean, once his papers are once they've been able to go through and catalog it at the archive, that's probably in the archive, the Archives of the Impossible. They're working on that now, digitizing and getting everything cataloged and stuff. I don't know when he also has a moratorium on opening it too. So it's gonna, I don't know when that happens. I think it was 10 years or something like that.
Oh wow, how interesting.
And then it'll be open to researchers.
How interesting. Oh, that's so funny that you brought up the pastry, because that was right here. I just wrote the Texas croissant on my notes here. Yeah. So that was my first ever academic conference. Well, let me back up. That's not quite true. I had been to an academic conference in Montreal, and everyone spoke French. So I was like, I was lost completely. And they had a few people that were me and this one other guy named Adnan, and so I gave a more like I worked as a teacher and I was doing outdoor work, so I was teaching in the outdoors, but I was a teacher. But I was a pretty flamboyant teacher, so I when I give a talk, I like walked around, I swing my arms, I like get right into the audience, and it was funny because the academic conference, I'd never seen anything like this where people just stand behind a podium and read from a script.
Yeah.
I was like, what's going on? What kind of presentation is this? And I had never seen that before.
Really quickly with the podium speaking at academic conferences, I think that one of the things I'm most impressed with Jeff Kripal is his ability to capture an audience while literally just reading his paper. Mm-hmm. His ability to evoke that and actually give you an experience, while he's just behind the podium reading his paper. I'm always very impressed with that, because there's the reading from the paper and it sounds like you're reading from a paper and it's not, like you can kind of get lost in the sort of drone of the reading. But Jeff gives us almost poetic evocation of the paper, he summons it and is able to read it. I've always been really impressed by that. But that surprised me as well. This topic going into that setting can often be kind of strange.
Yeah, so you've got an academic background.
To some extent. I more a professional background, I guess. I have an academic background as an independent scholar, so I never really quit after college. Just writing and thinking and being involved in that conversation. But in terms of my professional career, it's been in the business world, and nonprofit sector. And then I do work at a university, but I work on staff. So I work for the business school at the University of Georgia. So I'm in the milieu, and then I do an independent scholarship, and I've co-authored papers with Diana and Hussein Ali Agrama from University of Chicago and that. And I'm in a weird space. It's hard to sort of describe that relationship. I'm kind of like a weirdo that hovers around academia, and has been able to kind of join that conversation.
Well, that's what was going to be my question. What are the tensions between the UFO subculture and then the academic subculture?
Yeah.
I mean, the UFO subculture, there's plenty of level-headed people in the UFO subculture, but I will say there are some weirdos there too.
Well, it's interesting because it's hard to. It's really difficult, I think, because there's in the previous kind of iterations of this conversation within the academic milieu have been controlled by academia. So an academic is going out and looking at the subject, and then they're able to kind of sit within the framework of their discipline and look at the UFO topic or these experiences and study it from their discipline. And there's that kind of exchange of two things. But what we're seeing now, what's happening now because of the topic being normalized to some extent through the attention of the government and the attention of academics and the attention of science, which has always been there. But in the way that it is right now, it's changing it because this topic is going to change academia itself. Because you can't look at the UFO in the same way. You can't have that sort of objectivity with it. And I think that's one of the things that Diana explores in American Cosmic and Encounters, is the fact that when you approach this topic, if you do it seriously, especially in the current climate, you're interacting with something that's interactive. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You can't maintain academic. I think an extreme sort of object example of this would be Rutledge and project identification. I don't know if you're familiar with Harley Rutledge.
I have no idea. I've never heard of this.
He was a physicist at University of Missouri, and there was a flap. And this was, I believe, in the 70s or 80s. I don't know the exact dates, but he's a university professor in physics. He gets a team together, and they go out to look at this flap in Missouri and study it. And they actually encounter the phenomena, right? And it's some sort of plasma forms is what they were seeing and what they were recording that were appearing, and they had the characteristics of a UFO flap, right? So when he goes back though to his academic life, so there's out in the field, they're recording stuff. They got some interactions that were where, that was psychoactive, right? So they would think, move left, the plasma thing would move left, that kind of thing, and interact with it that way. Well, he gets back to his office and he starts having experiences where there's orbs in the building. So you're no longer just out in the field studying, taking your notes, coming back and writing your paper. You're writing up your report and your study, and the phenomena is sitting there with you, and that's just a physical effect, right? I mean, that's just seeing an orb. But we know that has more than just that. I mean, the orb shows up, you're going to start having dreams, synchronicities, all of these other experiences that are going to kind of flip the way you're interacting with reality. And for an academic and within the academic, structure, that's not supposed to happen. That's not a pleasant thing. And you can't bring, because especially the current state of academia, which is so administration driven, so driven by a kind of bureaucracy, and a really cutting out a lot of the stuff to just make it so that it's a through line to industry, and vocational training and that kind of thing. That becomes difficult with something like the UFO phenomena, which is multifaceted, very interpersonal. It enters your body and your mind, and you can't really escape that. So that was the paper that I co-authored with Greg Bishop and Hussein. Kind of addressed that question of, if academics are going to be taking this topic seriously in the way that they're saying and that they're putting forward with the archive and stuff like that, what does that actually mean for people? When you start having downloads, when you start having sort of visionary experiences, even on a minor level, it changes the way you interact with the world and other people, and it's not going to fit in the current state of academia. And industry has the same thing. I'm doing a course with Diana. We're designing, I think 7 classes in the first course series, on sort of an introduction to UFOs and UAP and the conversation that's going on now, for people who are new to this in a certain sense, or people who are familiar with it but new to the idea that this is actually becoming not just our conversations amongst each other, but a conversation with the broader culture in a way that it really hasn't been. Even in the sort of the height in the 50s, and that this level of open acceptance from people in positions of power in the society hasn't really been seen. And so, but how does that work? When I'm doing this stuff with the course and thinking about, well, how to put that out there. I'm used to talking about these topics on some of the more pop culture leaning social media sites, but how do you talk about this on LinkedIn? Which is for professionals and business people. Like, what's that conversation look like? And I'm trying to figure that out, because it's very strange. It's okay to post it now. Like, a couple of years ago, you'd look pretty weird posting about UFOs on LinkedIn, but now, with the military talking about it, the government talking about it, it's okay to do that. But what does that look like? Because we're still not at a point where it has totally taken hold in culture, but we're at this weird sort of pivot moment. And not only what does that look like to talk about it, openly, but also what does it mean knowing the implications of what that conversation is leading to? More attention to the topic often for people can lead to more interaction with the phenomena, and that can be very unmooring.
Ooh,
So what does that look like? When you have a mass opening of this idea, there's this question of disclosure and all this stuff, but if you've had any interaction with the phenomena, you know how unmooring it can be. And then to think that that's going to be opened up to the public in a way that, there's no, we're removing the sort of like safety net, and thinking about what that's going to be has been interesting and difficult.
Yeah. You said, this subject is being normalized, and I wrote normalized down there with a question mark. And essentially, this is not a normal subject.
Yeah.
This is a subject that will make you crazy.
Yeah.
literally, metaphorically, just you become unmoored. And I've given talks and stuff like that, and I've gotten good at telling the same stories over and over again, which is good in some ways and kind of a liability in other ways. But one of the things I say, which is true, is I said between 2006 and 2013, that's 7 years, I spent those years, 95% of my waking hours were spent like with me wondering if I had gone insane.
Yeah.
Like basically the world was projecting onto me, mostly in the form of synchronicities, like mind-blowing synchronicities. And the world, like I was essentially taught that the world does not act that way. And here it was, like, acting that way.
Yeah.
And I was like, and eventually I just accepted it, and that was helpful. That took a long time. It took a lot of hard work to just kind of say, okay, this is real. This is happening. It's like, and part of that was talking to enough people who had been through the same thing. Or
Right, exactly.
It's calmed down to a degree now where I feel like I'm still having just as many synchronicities, but they aren't frenetic synchronicities, where I was in a frenetic headspace and I was getting bombarded with frenetic synchronicities. Now I'm a little more peaceful and I'm getting bombarded with a little more peaceful synchronicities. That's overly simplistic, but that's essentially what's taking place. After the show is over, I'm going to get the link to that report. The fellow from that ran the team from Chicago, then you and Greg wrote a report.
Sure. The Harley Rutledge, or is that what you want, the project identification, or the co-authored paper with Greg and I?
Both of them. How's that?
Okay, sounds good. We'll get you all the links. Okay.
And then, you talked about a course you're doing it with Diana Pasulka, and is that through Morbid Academy?
No, we had done the UFO and horror course, horror and what was it? It was techno realism course, and that was with Morbid Anatomy. This one will be a teachable course, which is just it's Diana's thing. So it'll be just it's on Teachable. So it's separate from any organization.
Oh, is Teachable a website?
Yeah, Teachable's it's a platform for courses.
Okay, I'd never heard of it. Yeah.
Right. So you think of like the masterclass stuff that they advertise, right? So like Teachable is for it's a similar kind of setup.
Great. Okay. Good. Oh, so just so did you do a talk? Was part of the horror? Was it partially on films, like UFO films?
Yeah. That was kind of the focus. Was one of the things that I go on synchronicity, and that are kind of like a driver for my research. So I like to go down threads. Like I like when I read a statement, if it kind of dings, then I'll start to track that down, and then usually end up in some interesting areas. And so with American Cosmic, there was a line about Tyler D, who is this defense industry aerospace guy that's in the big, he's basically the person who introduces Diana to the reality of the government interest and business interest in the UFO topic. But he's described in one instance as almost being ageless. And it's not said, but the description is basically it's a conversation where he's being described as a hybrid. I mean, the implication is that he's somehow either a hybrid alien being, or that he's a starseed. There's this implication to it within the structure, within the words. It doesn't come straight out and say it, but it leads to that. And I was thinking, that's amazing that this is written without saying what it's saying, right? Like they didn't say starseed or hybrid or any of that, but just saying like he looks younger than he should, and all of these things in the context, I know what that's referring to. And that was really interesting to me, because it meant that concept had been so ingrained in some portion of the culture that I've had access to, that you didn't need to say the words for you to know what they were talking about. And so my question was, well, where did the starseed concept come from? Because at the time there was a lot of talk and interest in it, because it had some political ramifications in that. And so I read some of the articles that were coming out, and they weren't very good. And they went back to maybe, Bill Cooper They were going back to like the 80s, and I was like, no, that's not the beginning of this. So I started looking at that sort of through line, and in doing so, I started thinking more about Whitley's work. And it turned out that if you go back to the starting at 1947 with this idea of that being the beginning of the UFO era, although I would dispute that historically, but that idea in pop culture, right? So Kenneth Arnold, 1947, if you go back to that, the starseed concept actually comes out like a couple months later in Ray Palmer publication, Fantastic Adventures, the Son of the Sun piece. And it has everything. It has the entire Ancient Alien narrative. It has the Starseed narrative. It has the hybrid or aliens among us narrative. It's all right there in this piece in Fantastic Adventures. And so that was, I was kind of tracking that back, but it started getting me thinking about fiction, right? And how we think about how these topics that we live in to some extent, become reflected in pop culture, oftentimes through sci-fi,
mm-hmm.
right? That's what they do. But if you actually go back to the literature, sci-fi is actually not the best place to find these concepts. It's actually in weird tales. There's a lot of scholarship looking at Lovecraft's atheism and that kind of thing. But those stories and the terror that he describes, right? This kind of like sublime otherness, this like the inhumanism, we're facing an other that exists on equal or greater value to the universe or greater position in the universe than us. And all of that, like those senses, like that speaks more to what you experience when you encounter this other, right? Or this phenomena it's closer to that. And so I started tracking down that, and I realized, and there's also, Whitley, in thinking about Whitley, right? He's a horror author. And so much of his, or had been, he was a horror novelist who actually was one of the linchpins of horror becoming a legitimate genre. So, through his novels and then through the movies based off his novels, that was at a key point where what we know as the horror genre was developing into what it is now. And Whitley was right there at the center of that. He was also at the center of a new literature movement of pulling horror into literature as opposed to pulp fiction and that. As a genre, as something called horror versus, strange tales or weird tales or something like Robert Bloch's Psycho, which comes out a little bit before horror was horror. So he's sitting at the center of that. But what he's writing about in those novels that became popularized, he later looks back on and says, oh, I was writing about these experiences. Whether that was, like Eric Wargo's sense of time loops, where he was seeing what would happen and going back, or as Whitley understands it, he was having those experiences, or had those experiences. He was existing within the realm of the phenomena even then, despite not knowing it, and he was then filtering that into his novels. And he's talked about that, post-communion as well, where his fiction is a place for him to free associate and let some of the things that he can't consciously grasp about his experiences come out into, or things that you can't talk about. So all of that to say, this course that Diana and I did wanted to flip the idea of the UFO topic or this phenomena being a sci-fi thing. You see that like in the news when it comes out, it's, the government's looking at science fiction or whatever, and I wanted to look at it, through horror, and not in the sense of like murder and like death and terror and all that, but horror, as the story narratives of us facing this other, and how does that interact? Whether the other is death or some non-human intelligence or ourselves or whatever, that's captured in the narrative of horror. So we did this course series that sort of explored that, and we were able to get different people who've worked on horror films to talk about their experiences. Richard Stanley had recently, a couple years ago, did a version of The Color Out of Space, which starred Nicolas Cage.
Yes.
Or Cage.
Yeah.
And we had one of his associates who had written some of the script, Amanda
Radcliffe. I know her well.
Yeah, and she's amazing. She's just a really awesome person. So it was great to have her, and be able to talk to her and explore these ideas with her. But the experiences that she had and that were on that movie production, and the experiences that were essentially looked like there was something speaking and interacting with the production through synchronicities, through mediumship, through EVPs on the recording, and then Richard and Amanda being practicing, ritual magicians, were working that into the structure of the film itself. So when they got EVP communications, which were kind of clicks and different things, they used that in the soundtrack when they're demonstrating the color out of space, non-human intelligence interacting and stuff. So they wove the synchronicities and the phenomena that they were experiencing on set into the production of the film, and then that comes out, and it made I think one of the most successful adaptations of Lovecraft stuff on film. But it was really interesting to talk about that, and to kind of look at those topics. And again, horror not just as gore and that kind of thing, but horror as that uncanniness, that sense of otherness. So we had done that, and then Diane and I have been in conversation since 2016. So we've co-written a paper together. We did this course, and then she kind of wanted to do an introduction and a sort of broader scope kind of course. And so that's where we're at now, working on developing that to be a resource. Again, because this pivot that we're seeing in culture, it's really interesting because, I don't know how it's going to pivot. I mean, it sounds good in words. You can say, UFOs are real, or I believe in UFOs, or, whatever. But when you take that out of just the word, and it's the phenomena, it's not just an I believe thing. Like, and it's not, I don't see how that fits in with any of our stable structures,
Good. I was writing some notes furiously as you were talking there. So a few things, in pop culture, like a book that addresses the UFO clearly, plainly, is Slaughterhouse-Five.
Yeah.
Billy Pilgrim is abducted by flying saucers, taken to another planet, and he's basically studied like a zoo creature.
Right.
And at the same time, he's slipping in and out of time.
Right.
Like the book is written in this disjointed way, which I suspect was very early on. I think that's a little more normal now in creative fiction, is to chop the storyline up and tell it out of order. I'm thinking of Pulp Fiction as a good example of a mixed up storyline like that. But the first reference I could really truly find of an owl and a UFO in a book, and man, I was searching, like formally in a book, was Communion with Whitley Strieber on page 27. They're the owls on the windowsill.
Right.
And he tells his wife Anne that he saw an owl last night. And the way he tells it, it makes sense to me, having talked to so many thousands of people at this point. But he's basically saying, I was abducted last night.
Right.
But the way he said it was, there was an owl in the house last night. And now Slaughterhouse-Five was written in I think it was published in 1968, and was an immense, huge event. And I mean, that would be one of the seminal books of the 20th century.
Absolutely.
But not strictly literary, but just in a pop culture framework and its influence. But Billy Pilgrim, there's one scene where he knows, because he's trapped in this time loop kind of thing, where he's shuttling back and forth in time. He became unstuck in time. I think that's the first line of the book. Billy Pilgrim became unstuck in time. And then he walks into the backyard knowing full well that there's going to be a flying saucer waiting for him. He says, I looked up and saw a flying saucer with a purple neon glow and the sound of a mournful owl in the distance. This is right there, side by side, right there.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
And then I went through, and then I can't find it now. I just tried to look it up recently, but there was a kind of a Cliff Notes. I think that must have been written a while ago. It wasn't technically the Cliff Notes that you would find on the rack at the bookstore, but it was essentially an academic going through and giving kind of his review of the structure of Slaughterhouse-Five. And he says it straight up in there. He says the owl represents UFO contact.
Interesting. Yeah.
This is, and if you go through it there, every time that he becomes unstuck in time and meets the Tralfamadorians, these aliens,
Right.
that don't travel in time the same way we do. There's a funny scene where he talks about how, like the aliens all laugh when Billy Pilgrim describes time as like this linear thing that starts in one place and goes forward, and they like, oh, what those funny humans. And but every time he like essentially meets the aliens, there's a point in the book where there's a reference to an owl. And it's either like there's an owl clock, and he goes to the optometrist, and the little thing that the optometrist tests your eyes with, he says looks like an owl face, and so it's in there. It is fully in there,
Right.
point by point by point. That didn't happen by accident. So the first reference, like the first clean reference of owls and UFOs, is in fiction,
Right.
and that's in Slaughterhouse-Five, which came out 1960, like almost 20 years before Whitley Strieber's book.
Yeah, and then in I think it's Night Church, which is one of Whitley's novels before Communion. There's an owl clock right before a kid gets abducted.
Oh, how interesting!
Looks up and sees an owl clock. Yeah, and that's the interesting thing with Whitley's work. You see that that was what So with Vonnegut writing about the owl and the UFO, and that being the first instance that you could find. I think that's what's interesting when you look back at Whitley's stuff, because he, it all folds in. Like it's almost as if his work contains that entire process, right? So you've got Vonnegut writing it in one book, and then he goes on to write other things, but then it gets woven into the bigger history of like, oh, that's the first reference. And Whitley's work like becomes this weird sort of self-referential version of that, where like, it's almost as if Whitley's work is the history of that. That was something that when I was looking at Communion, I realized was that Communion not only as a work, he says a true story, right? It's Communion, a true story. And I think story is really important because he's telling a story. It's a story about his experience, but it's still, there's a sense of it's a story. And it's interesting because it's almost the reversal of the beginning of what became horror, is Edgar Allan Poe is one of the, the beginnings of modern horror, and also one of the people to use that frame narrative of the, pulling it into reality with it's a letter form or something like that. That form, or Frankenstein's another good example of that, like written in letters and diary entries and stuff like that, or Dracula, right? So at the very beginning, the sense of bending reality and these topics entering reality. And then you look at Whitley's work, and Whitley's work encompasses that entire thing, and that was something that was really intriguing, and seeing, it seems like, when someone has these experiences, and I think this is where my take, I don't know if this is exactly what Jeff Kripal is talking about with the authors of The Impossible, but, the people that like Vallée and Whitley, and they start to, their work and their thought and that starts to sort of enfold within itself these larger narratives and these larger sort of cultural things that other people are experiencing, as a little blip in their life. Their narratives take on this sense of actually, bringing this all in and sort of encompassing it and reflecting it in weird ways. I don't know if that fully makes sense.
Oh my God.
In the way that I'm describing.
My God, I'm living it. I'm living it right now. I mean, the references to owls that show up in movies now, in sci-fi UFO movies. Like, there's a movie called Skyman, and it was directed by the same guy who directed the Blair Witch Project.
Oh, okay.
And it's done in a sort of Blair Witch Project-y sort of way. You would love it. Now, but it's kind of done as a documentary. Like, this documentary film crew is following this guy around who had a UFO contact experience in his youth, and they kind of cut back to old newspaper articles and old kind of VHS-looking interviews that he did as a boy. And now he's a grown man. He's totally obsessed with the UFO thing. And now within this movie, it's shot like a handheld kind of documentary. as if the film crew's following this guy around. And the actor, I can't remember the actor who played the main character. He's wonderful, but it's out in the desert and takes place in California. And his sister is there, and he's got a friend, and they're kind of hiding out in the desert. They kind of go on a retreat. They're like, okay, let's get out of town and let's go to the family little plot out in the desert where there's a trailer out there that the family has. So they're at the trailer, and that's all they've been talking about UFOs, and he's been talking about abduction the whole time. And the character goes, look, and there's 2 owls on the trailer next to this, like abandoned trailer right next to them. It's kind of a spooky scene in the desert at night, and there's shining flashlights on the owls. And the main character tells to his friend, he's, look, those are owls. And he turns to the friend, he goes, Mike Cleland wrote a whole book on owls.
That's awesome. Oh, wow. That's amazing. Oh, man.
And then they kind of say, like, like, these are messengers. Oh my God. It's all of like 30 seconds, but he basically gives a 30 seconds paranoid synopsis of my book.
Yeah, yeah.
And at the end he goes, this is more than just a message. It's synchronicity.
That's awesome.
And the haunted house music goes, so wow. So like
that's fantastic.
I'm in there. I'm already in there. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're written into it. You got written into you're in the fiction, you're in the real life. And see, that's really interesting, right? That's part of the phenomena. That entrance into the fictional, what we call fictional, which is really an expression of these inner states and all of that, like written out and presented in these symbolic forms and that. But yeah, that entering into it. I mean, William S. Burroughs talked about write yourself into history. Burroughs was very focused on the process of writing as a magical act, and the idea that when you start to play with words, you're playing with reality. When he did his famous cut-up experiments, it wasn't just cutting up words, but he was actually experimenting. He has notebooks where he was experimenting. If I cut up these things, how does that affect my reality? Like, what changes about that? Because he would write about how be careful what you write. Because, there's, Jeff Kripal actually writes about a lot of that in Mutants and Mystics, where, examples of comic book writers, I forget the guy, you may know, that one illustrator who was doing a comic where a gorilla...
Mensch, he was doing a Planet of the Apes comic. Mensch was his last name. I think it's right.
Yeah. And while he's doing this comic, his wife is in their bottom thing, and there's a guy coming in, breaking into their house, and basically, I don't know, I don't think assaulting her, but like tying her up to rob burglar or something like that. So it was this weird
full on trauma. It was bad.
Oh, was it like yeah. I mean that, and then imagine that, like you're sitting there. You're interacting with this fiction that you're writing, and it's actually happening, which you can imagine because that's part of the thing,
I got some stories.
and again, in our current time period, having had those experiences, how do we then watch as the wider public gets initiated into that? Like, what is our role in that? What do we do with that?
I think there was a quote that Jeff Kripal uses. He was talking back and forth. He was having in conversation with Whitley Strieber, basically saying, like if our science fiction informs our ideas on what the future can be, on what the unknown can be, what's our responsibility here? Like, how does that work? And what do we need to do? And Whitley, as is his way, just calmly said, well, we need to write better science fiction.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's interesting. We have these tools. I'm glad that you've restarted the podcast, because I think these are the kind of things that are necessary. To sort of lay that groundwork.
So at one point, I was going to ask it near the end. I was going to bring up my own book, my novel, The Unseen, which I sent a digital copy to you, and I think did I send a print copy to you also? Mm-hmm. Oh, right on there it is. Great. Okay, here, let me tell you a story about. I'll give you one. So like, oh man, I could just like, I'll start over. This is the problem. So the level of abandonment that I had to put myself through. This was not a formal writing process. I mean, obviously, yes, I had to make sure the commas were in the right place. I had an editor that helped me with that. I had to not put two adjectives in the sentence when one would do, like these kind of normal things I I did kind of in the editing process afterwards, but the actual creative act of writing was a form of letting go that I have never been through before. Like I had to get out of the way and let the story do what the story was going to do. The story was originally going to be a comic book.
Right, that's right. Yeah, you were going to do a graphic novel, right? Like a
a graphic novel. Yeah, and do you know Christopher Knowles? Yeah, so he worked in the comic book industry. This is back in I think 2011. I contacted him. The book will be tomorrow. Is the 1 year anniversary that the novel was published, May 16th of last year. So
congratulations.
Thank you. And so this is going back a long time. This story was kind of gestating and brewing for a long time, but I wanted to do it as a graphic novel. I was going to do it myself. I've been a professional illustrator since I was like 12, and I contacted him and said, hey, I got this idea for a graphic novel. It's going to be like this. I have this idea. I've got a good outline. And Chris Knowles is from the East Coast. He's from Boston. And he was like, don't do it. Don't even think about it. Like, you'll make yourself crazy because it's like so much work. You need to hire a team. You got to have one person does the inking, one person does the coloring, one person does the text, one person does the layout. And I was like, and I just like deflated. Oh God, this thing. Yes. So I got super like disillusioned and put the thing on a shelf and then pulled it out 2018 and worked on it for a summer. I had done the first 2 books and I worked on that book for like a whole summer and I got nowhere. I was like, oh, I can work on this. I got nowhere. And then I put it away. And then during the pandemic, the whole world turned into hermits and I just gave myself over to that book. But wow. So here, I'll tell you a story. So there's a point in this story, I'm not giving anything away in the plot, where the 2 main characters, a little bit of a love interest there, and they're sitting on a swing set behind an elementary school. Mm-hmm. And their 2 owls land on the swing set, and it kind of zaps them. It's a little more poetic the way I say it. But this comes from a real story. This is informed by a real story that happened with a woman. Her name is Susan Kornacki, and she is in the first owl book that I wrote, The Messengers, and she tells the story of, it's an amazing story where she was at an Easter party with her family, and she felt like this rush going up and down her spine. This would have been this is probably 15 years ago or so this happened. So, and then she leaves the party, tells her husband, I got to get out of here. Something's up. And he's like worried. And so she runs home and I've talked to other people and people say that's a Kundalini awakening. And I asked her, was that a Kundalini awakening? She said, no. It's her experience. So I'm going to trust her on that. But she said there was like a Tesla coil going off up and down her spine. And this is on Easter Sunday. Like a day, like metaphoric of day of rebirth, like magical rebirth.
Oh, interesting.
And so she lays on a hammock in her backyard.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful spring day in New England.
Yeah.
And as soon as she lays down, an owl lands on one branch of the tree. The hammock's tied between 2 trees. And one owl lands on one tree, and another owl lands on another tree, and they start squawking back and forth to each other. She says it is plain. I recorded the conversation I had. She says it. She said there was energy running up and down through me, up and down my spine, and I was being recalibrated. Like she says, I was being recalibrated. Mm-hmm. And her husband comes home, and he's worried about her. He says, how you doing? And she says, what do you see? And he said, there's an owl in that branch hooting, and there's an owl in that branch hooting. She goes, And then after this, she basically said it was a transformative experience. After that, the phone started ringing. People she knew or kind of knew, or people just were reaching out. They would ask her, can you do an energy healing on me? She had never advertised. She never told anything like that.
Oh, weird. Yeah, yeah.
And she's someone who worked with John Mack, and she's very open about her UFO contact experiences. Mm-hmm. And she started doing energy healing after this event.
Yeah.
So it just feels like she was a component on like some circuit board and being zapped. So go to the fiction. I use that to inform the fiction in a sense. So I have a real life event.
Yeah.
And I massaged it a little bit to fit in the story the way I needed it to. But the 2 people basically get zapped and pass out, and they both have what would be a near-death experience. Mm-hmm. And I used the near-death experience literature to inform like how I described it.
Right.
And then I knew this. The whole story hinges on this point.
Right.
Right. The whole story hinges on this point. So I had to like I knew I had to write this part, and I was doing anything I could to avoid it. I was figuring out every way to procrastinate about it. And I knew I had to write it. And there came a night where I was like, and I had like an outline, like I got to include this and this and this. I got to put it in this order. So I had a tidy outline, but I hadn't written it. And then there came a night where like, tonight's the night. And I furiously wrote and stayed up late. And it was really flowing good. And then the next morning I get up and I'm reading my own writing. I was like, oh yeah, this is a little redundant here. I'll clean this up. Oh yeah, let me put a comma here. Oh yeah, okay. I'll add this word here. And like, oh, let me put this sentence here instead of there. And then I kind of went, oh shit, what have I done? Like this whole story hinges on two people having a shared near-death experience. Mm-hmm. They're not dead even, but they're having what would, like a shared, like, so they both enter the same timeless realm. They both enter the
right.
And I'm like, oh crap, what did I do? Like that's, no, the whole, I totally, this whole book is now useless because it's so unbelievable. Like I'm expecting people to like buy into this shared near-death experience. Yeah. And as I'm having that thought, like complete and total disillusionment in front of the keyboard, I was like, oh God, I can hardly stay awake. I'm like, oh God, I'm going to fall asleep right here at the desk. So I laid down and boom, I went out like totally went deep sleep. And I woke up, I don't know, it was like probably an hour later, but it was one of those things where it was like, is it the next morning? Like what happened? And so I get up and I go back to the desk and I did something that I kind of just like, I checked Facebook. I kind of do that normally, but and I had gotten a friend request from someone. And I get friend requests all the time, but I never do this, almost never do this. It's like, there's bots and people and like, I was scams and I was like, okay, I'm going to Google this woman's name.
Yeah. Yeah.
I Googled her name and she wrote a book about a shared near-death experience.
Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And so I've since become really good friends with her. And she you may have met her. Her name is Scarlett Heinbuch. She was at the conference.
Oh no, I don't think I did.
Yeah. So she wrote a book. She's friends with Sharon Hewitt Rowlett, who is the publisher of the book.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
And it's a beautiful book. And she tells the story of, to tell it quickly is going to do a disservice.
Oh, I know. I didn't recognize her name, but yeah, I know who you're talking about because Sharon had posted about that book.
Yes. So she in the story, she is asked to come and give Reiki to a man who's dying. The man's mother says, will you go my son is dying. Will you perform Reiki on my dying son? He's not expected to live. And give him comfort. And she says, of course. And she goes there and she holds his hand. She doesn't even know what he looks like. He's got tape over his face and tubes up his nose and a breathing in his mouth and a little cap on and she holds his hand and whoosh, she's like vaulted into this other reality. And she sees this guy like floating away. He's going into the light. And she like pulls him back. She holds his hand and pulls him back. And she describes it just the terms that like of like this infinite timeless realm of love and eternity and understanding and bliss. And then whoosh, she's back. And then he makes a full recovery. And they've been married for like 12 years.
Yeah.
So that's a strong example of what took place during the writing of that book. But I don't know if you haven't heard this story. I've told it a few times. She's given me permission to tell it. And it reflects the like, wow, that's heavy.
Yeah. That's exactly and that,
so let me just say, from that point on, like I didn't give it a second thought. It's in the book. I'm not going to second guess it. There's no disillusionment. Man, it's in
right.
Like I'm proceeding forward.
Well, and that's interesting because that actually, you just kind of answered my question, in my personal question of like how to move forward with this. You know, how to move forward in talking about this stuff. And my question was posed without giving credence to the interactivity of the phenomena itself, which is going to speak on its own behalf, you know? So we're kind of here doing what we do. And, usually when it really clicks is because that other speaks back, you know, whatever that is.
Mm-hmm.
We have that communication That's interesting. I want to. So now my question is, what does that look like, right? Like now, what does that look like when the others start speaking back to the mass public? You know, I mean, because there is this question, like the Soul Foundation, out of it's not out of Stanford, but Gary Nolan is heading that up, and they had a conference to kind of look at these issues with academics and industry people, and that. No. It's weird. I live in rural Georgia, and I enjoy being in the woods.
Oh, I understand that. Yeah.
Yeah, unless I'm like sorely tempted, or someone's paying for my ticket to go. I usually just prefer, like, I'll watch the YouTube later. You know, like, I'm good. Like, I can go out to the woods and have the conversation I need to have. Wait for the YouTube on the other stuff. Which actually, with the Soul Foundation thing, I didn't even start watching the videos until now. But this question of disclosure, you know, that term, I don't like the term. I don't, because I mean, it's weird to interact with this stuff, and then hear something like disclosure, because that doesn't fit the reality of being in it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, I don't know what that means. I had mentioned to you, you know, I grew up in a house that had poltergeist phenomena when I was until I was 7.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what that means. Like, what's disclosure? For me, like, that doesn't make sense, because my disclosure happened when I was born. Like, I entered into a situation where things were happening which didn't fit the consensus reality, you know? So I can't even conceive of what that is. But the sense in which, like, people trying to think and theorize how that will react, you know, I mean, for the public, and that, you know, but then it's a question of, does the phenomena interact with all of the public then, right? Like, if there is this wider opening, when does that start to happen? Like, what does that look like? Because you were talking about your mind state, right? Your mind state with this stuff, and a synchronicity can be frightening and paranoia inducing,
Mm-hmm.
or it can be make you feel like, oh, okay, I'm on the right track, even if it's kind of negative, you know, like this makes sense for this growth or whatever. And so much of it is tied to our perception, and the current global mind is not a healthy mind, you know. So does the phenomena come in and heal that? Or does it come in and start getting filtered through kind of the cracks in our global culture, you know? What does that look like? That's, you know.
So there's a point when people have these experiences. I described it earlier. Like, I felt like I had gone insane. I spent 7 years struggling. I was a mess. I lost friends.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, like, I look at the life I led. I had to, like, give up the life I had been leading. There was other reasons too. Just, I was working in an outdoor school, and it's kind of a youth culture, and all of a sudden I was in my 50s, and it wasn't as easy as it used to be to carry a big pack in the mountains. So, and then my whole life changed.
Yeah.
Everything changed. I stopped doing illustration work and started doing writing work. It was like, yeah, everything changed. And so, given what you just said there, what happens if the whole world goes through this disclosure awakening and has that frenetic, unmoored, synchronistic storm? What if the whole world...
Right.
I mean, in a way, we are dealing with it, because the news right now is, like, as nutty as it gets. I mean, it seems like it...
Yeah, as you're describing it, I'm thinking, like, wow, is that what we're seeing? Is that part of what we're seeing? Is this kind of surreal madness that is happening in the culture? You know, is that a sign of the beginning of this information becoming more accepted on a wider level, you know? Because it...
Yeah, Philip K. Dick is writing our reality. Like, we're not we're like somewhere in the middle of the book right now. And it's like, like his books don't always end up so nice either. So
I was talking to a friend the other day. I think it may have even been Greg Bishop. And I was like, are we living in like, I think it's Clans of the Alphane Moon, which is about, it's a colony where everyone has a behavioral disorder. And each behavioral disorder has created its own society based on its needs. And then they interact with each other in this kind of like council, you know, but you have the frictions of each different well-defined behavioral disorder interacting, you know. And so the people who are paranoid act a certain way, like the people who have like psychopathy like act a certain way, and they all have to like interact, and I was like, this kind of feels like we're in that Philip K. Dick mode here.
Yeah, UFO Twitter is like that. Yeah,
I can't.
I don't. I just yeah.
And that's the sad thing too, is because this, it can be unmooring, but once you get through that process, then the integration with a wider reality is wonderful, and the conversations you can have and the experience you can have as a person is great. And it's really sad that the topic in the public becomes just such a, like a knife fight, and like just egos and like meanness, just so much meanness. And like, it's one thing to have a debate or to disagree, and even to do so maybe in a way that's a little bit more aggressive, but it's another thing just to be mean, and so much of it is just mean. And it's disappointing.
And are you talking about the UFO culture or just the general culture?
Yeah, the UFO, the general
political culture is a mess. Yeah.
Yeah, the political culture, but the UFO culture and these topics around this stuff, it's often very heated.
And I whatever I'm doing, I must feed the algorithm in a way that I'm seeing very little of that meanness.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good.
And I'm doing that on purpose. I'm avoiding anything that, like I mentioned, UFO Twitter. There's just places I won't go and won't touch. But
yeah,
so I feel like I've been immune.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I've been careful to not contaminate myself with that stuff, and I certainly don't engage.
Right.
When people try to push my buttons, I just turn the other cheek and
yes.
I got plenty on my desk to keep me busy. I don't need to be pulled off track.
That's right.
So here, let me tell a quick little story. This is I told this recently to a friend just about, this is like, kind of a life thing that happened to me, and how it reflects the weirdness of the UFO subject in a way. So I was living in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and I was 30, and it was my birthday. It was in August, and my parents came out for my birthday. My dad has the same birthday, so we celebrated our birthday together in Jackson Hole. So they're in their 60s, and I'm 30, and this would have been around 1992, and there's like a place you have lunch in the park, and it's in Grand Teton National Park, and the big Tetons, the beautiful mountains are there, and it's August, and so I had left New York City to be a ski bum and a climbing bum. So I was climbing all the time in the mountains, and I was skiing all the time all winter long and such. And so we're there with my parents, and I was the youngest. And I drew cartoons. Like my dad worked for General Motors, my brother worked in engineering, and I drew cartoons, and that was my job. So I got paid pretty good. I did pretty well for a bunch of years there. So, and we're eating lunch there at this little picnic table, and the big mountains are there. My mom and dad look up at the mountains and they go, "What is that up there? What is that up there? What is that white stuff up there?" I'm like, "Mom, Dad, that's snow." And they looked at me like, "Oh, Mike, it's always something with you. It is not snow." It's like we're in shorts. It's hot. It's August. And I'm like, that's snow.
Yeah.
And I'm like, and then they go, "Has anyone ever been up there?" And I was like, the pictures that I sent you, this is like of me standing on top of the mountain. I was up there. And they're like, "Oh, Mike, you say the funny, you're like," and it was like totally like this, like they didn't believe me. It was like I was 5 years old talking about Santa Claus or something.
Yeah.
And I was just like, so this is how, so I'm doing this research on owls and UFOs, right? So I'm going, this is the most esoteric little niche. It is the thinnest little sliver, and I'm pulling on the tiniest thread, and it's so rich. The stories are so rich and so rewarding and so magical and so powerful and so mythic.
Yeah.
And so, but I feel like in the UFO culture, like it feels like they're like, "Oh, Mike, owls and UFOs, like, aren't you just like a naive little kid,
Well, and it's funny because the people who interact with the phenomena don't say that.
Exactly.
They never say that because they're like, "Oh yeah, that makes sense. Like this is totally, absolutely." I mean,
if it's not owls, it's synchronicities or it's psychic knowing or it's paranormal events or
But the owl thing is pretty prevalent in an interesting way. I mean, that was that essay that I did about Whitley and Jeff's book, The Supernatural, in which I actually talked about your work.
I got it footnoted right here. I was going to ask you about it, so keep going.
Yeah. So background on this for people listening is you started your blog in 2009.
Mm-hmm.
I started my blog in 2009. My blog was called The Eyeless Owl, which was a joke because around that time there was a lot of stuff about Bohemian Grove and Hidden Elite and all this stuff. And the eye in the pyramid and that. So I took the eye out, right? And it was the owl without, so it was not this Illuminati thing, but it was exploring the weird topics that were being explored. It was just, it was a personal joke for the name or whatever, but it was the Eyeless Owl. Also, there's a book called The Blind Owl, which by an Iranian author whose name, I think it's Haidat or something like that. It's a really interesting, I don't even know how to describe it. It's a really existential kind of novel. It's an intense, really interesting novel. It's called The Blind Owl. The blind owl represents enlightenment in the book, but kind of a negative side to enlightenment. It's an interesting book. Anyway, I put up this blog, start writing about stuff. That blog represented me, reaching a point in my professional career where social media was coming out in 2009. Twitter started in 2007, I think. So we're starting to enter this new realm of communications. And I was working with a guy at a marketing agency, and he told me, he's like, I'm 40 years old and I'm aging out of marketing, because you really got to be on the culture. You got to be in it. And that's actually part of what he was paying me for, was to kind of be a trend spotter and stuff like that. And so he was like, what you have to do is you have to set up all your social media. So get a blog, do all this stuff. So I was like, I don't really want to write about business stuff. I'm interested in that culture, but I don't want to write, consulting kind of blog writing. So, my background in studying cognitive philosophy and popular belief and ritual structures and stuff like that, I was like, well, I can take my interests. When I graduated, I had actually asked one of my professors, like, how do I go and study this full time? And she was like, well, you got to learn 2 more languages. You have to, go to grad school. I hope you get in. You got to go to a good grad school so that you can pursue this stuff. And I was like, okay, that's a lot. So I just went into the professional world. So 2009 hits. I have this choice. I'm going to write about these topics that I enjoy and the things that I actually experience. So we're gonna do that. We're gonna go that way. So we started out around the same time. Fast forward to the supernatural. There was just a stream of synchronicities occurring when that book was being promoted. I had seen the promotion pop up, and at the time, Mitch Horowitz was an acquisitions editor for Penguin, and I made the joke, like, oh, I bet Mitch had something to do with it, and it turned out he was the editor who had brought that book forward and everything. So that, not so much a synchronicity, because I kind of knew that was true, but as the ad popped up that I saw, owls started going nuts outside. At the time, I was living on another property in rural Georgia, and like the owls at that moment just went crazy. And I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting, and I was in a 200-year-old farmhouse. So it added that nice atmosphere, right? But the synchronicities didn't quit. And the kind of just weird sort of parallels didn't quit. And I don't know which came first off the top of my head, but there was one point where you and Whitley were talking on a podcast, and I was listening to it, and I suddenly had the bottom of reality drop out, where my mind-body thing just fused. So, where me and memory and everything, it was just one stream, and it was almost like falling down a tunnel. And I went back to when I was 7 years old. In 1987, and Communion was published. It was at a time when my parents were moving from Chicago to Arizona, so we were in airports, we were in malls. How do you keep the kid entertained on this move? We're in bookstores, and all that. And I just, at that moment, listening to you and Whitley talk, suddenly flowed back to the impact of the Communion cover. Which, saying those words doesn't fit the experience of it, though, because it was this weird through line, which gets even weirder now that, that essay led into, in part, me talking to Diana and that. I mean, this was even before that, so those interactions and that, stemming out of this and having this weird sort of time loop experience with the Communion cover, as you were talking about that, And then shortly thereafter, I was leaving the house, and there was a 4-foot owl.
4-foot tops.
It was a massive owl thing sitting. Or no, I'm sorry, 4 foot. That's too high. It was maybe like two to three, like 2.5. It was a big owl, right? Like,
great. Okay, gotcha.
Sitting in the middle of the road, like in the middle of my driveway, which is a dirt road way back in the woods. But it's just sitting there.
Okay.
I think we lived on that property for 5 years. I'd never seen that. The owls, you could see them; they would fly and stuff like that, and you'd hear them. But having one sit there, like this massive owl, and I said 4 foot because it came up to my waist, like it was huge. It was this big owl, and it's sitting there, and I'm like, okay, the owl's not going to sit there. As I walked to my car, and it sat there, and I was like, okay, surely the owl's not going to sit there when I turn on my car, and it sat there, and I was like, I'm not going to run over an owl, like I'm not going to be just like gunning it to the owl to hoping it flies away or whatever. So I'm like, I'm going to have to walk up to this thing and like get it to go, so I walk up and it doesn't move. And I'm like, you're a wild creature. I'm a person walking at you. Like you need to, it didn't fluff. It didn't get defensive. It just sat there. And I was like, okay, like I don't want to get close enough where you're going to fly up in my face. Like, like, what is this? What are we going to do? Finally, I got, maybe, a couple feet from it, and the thing flies up into a tree and just starts watching me. So it didn't even fly away fully. And I'm like, what? This is not a normal behavior for any bird. This is really weird. So drive out. I don't know if it was the next day my car died, like in a horrible way, and I got stuck and had a bunch of weird interactions with strangers who had I'm stuck in it was outside of Athens, but you're like still like I was in a parking lot and like people are coming out from like the local like trailer park behind the Walmart like to help me and stuff. I've got like shade tree mechanics giving me advice while I'm like parked with my car radiator exploding, but it was after this owl thing had happened. And then I just started, it was so strange. These things all just started interacting in ways that, since we'd moved to rural Georgia, everything was kind of weird anyway. Like car broke down, we got stuck for a while and stuff. So I was used to just sort of living on the edge of rural living. I don't know. But yeah, things just got really weird, and there was, this weird time loop thing, this owl showing up and all of that. And then reading the book itself when it finally came out and I got a copy of it, I was in a dentist's waiting room.
And which book is this?
This is The Supernatural.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, when it finally came out and I got a hold of it, after having all these weird synchronicities leading up to it, I was in a dentist's office for my partner. She was getting some stuff done on her teeth, and I'm in the waiting room, and I open it up, and there was some kind of synchronistic passage that I read, and I look up, and the waiting room has a big owl statue in it, and it was just like constant, just like these things just like happening. I was like, what the, you're living in this, and it's not always. If you were writing a movie, it would all lead somewhere direct, right? Like you would have these plot points that lead direct, but you're just saturated in it, and then the meanings sort of percolate up later, sometimes years later, like, the Atlas Owl blog, and then that, coming into that current moment with it. So yeah, it's really strange. And that's, just again, talking to your niche, that thin thread is such a thick space, it's such a wide thing. And if you've had the experiences, you recognize it, which is, again, I think it keeps going back to me where I'm thinking about how does the public deal with this? Like it's a different world. You enter a different way of interacting with reality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. I wrote some notes while you were talking there. So you said you were just outside of Athens. So Athens is also the capital of Greece, and Athena. That's where Athena has the owl, and so the owl is kind of the mascot of the entire of Athens.
Yeah, yeah. There's a statue in downtown Athens of Athena from a local artist.
Does she have a companion owl?
I don't think it has an owl. It's this one has just the shield and the spear, and that I don't think there's.
Sometimes in art. She's often pictured with an owl.
Yeah.
Then this is a lot of this is just Google research. But the thought is that the owls would roost in the Parthenon, the Palace Athena, on the hilltop in Athens.
Oh, it's like an owl rook kind of like. Yeah.
So that like which came first, Athena or the owls? It's kind of blurred together there. But
Yeah.
the little owl is the Latin name is Athena noctur, which means night. I think I've got where's Diana Pasulko when we need her here. And so it basically translates to the owl of night, which references Athena. So anyway, this is Mike, and I am chiming in during the editing. I got a little messed up there trying to define the Latin name for the little owl. I looked it up on Wikipedia here, and the Latin name for the little owl is Athene noctua. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Athene noctua. Now, Athene is obviously Athena, the Greek goddess of wisdom, and also the namesake of the city of Athens. And noctua, in Latin, means night owl. So the literal translation for Athene noctua would be Athena, the night owl. Back to the interview. So that just was funny, like, oh, Athens, oh, there you have it. So that's a small one, but I mean, that's the universe wants to, like, Whitley Strieber's really good at saying, you need to pay attention to even the smallest little clue.
You do, yeah. It's interesting, because it is. I mean, it's subtle. There's very subtle things.
Yeah.
That all tie it together, almost as if something is speaking.
So I had a short list of questions. Wow, we've covered a lot of them just organically, we hit them. I'm back up a little bit. Now, I'm from Michigan. I'm by my very nature very, in some ways I'm humble, in some ways I'm not humble at all, but I'm cautious to bring this up. But what did you think of the book, the novel, The Unseen?
So it was unnerving in the sense that it started to have similar sort of retrocausal memory activation as I was reading it. I actually got unnerved reading it because it was opening up feelings that I hadn't accessed or thought about since I was a kid.
About the desert, because you were in Arizona. Yeah,
because I was in Arizona, and not just that, but also just the sort of eerie feeling. I guess, now looking back on it, I was doing, at the very least, some very strong creative visualization as a kid when I was, like under 7, where I would go to bed and just have a world in my head where I was in, but there was some other weird stuff around that I would be up in the middle of the night just staring out the window. Be like 4 a.m, and I'm like 5. And I'm just staring like out the window, and then not much memory before that or after that, and there was just, so for whatever reason, when I started reading The Unseen and going through it, that space opened up, that space, which I had not thought about in many, many, many decades. That space in my head had not been open. The Unseen opened that, and that was really strange for me.
How interesting. Because, I mean, the character of John is very much me in many ways. Obviously, in some ways it's not. Mm-hmm. John has a full head of hair. That was something I added to the plot. But there was all the stuff about him in his youth and the creative process in his youth. Mm-hmm. And then sort of achieving success and fame with his artwork, and then finding that meaningless and sort of the emptiness that brought on. That was based a lot on, like I worked in advertising. I got paid a lot of money, and I I was sought after in New York City as a 20-something-year-old, and then like that wasn't working. And basically I had a nervous breakdown. Like it was like, oh, this is I'm not following my soul path by drawing pictures of women holding bottles of dishwashing liquid. So, big life changes, which my parents never understood. Like I moved out to West and became a ski bum and a climbing bum for 25 years. So I was going to do it for 1 year, and it turned into a quarter of a century. So I was telling a really personal story, and I was using the creative process as a sort of metaphor. Like it never says, at no point in the book does it say UFO.
Yeah, that was beautiful. I mean, because, and that's the thing is that I said this to Diana, where I don't know what a UFO is. I don't know what that word means. We use it as a marker for this vast and multifaceted experiential thing that happens. But what is it? What does that mean? So I thought it was wonderful to have the experiences and the feeling of it captured without ever saying that word. And without ever using that marker, because if you to take that marker out explores, I think, a lot more of what gets covered up by that marker, which is what you did.
Which I did. That it was 100% on purpose. Yeah. I wanted people to read that book and not even know it was a UFO book.
Yeah, and I think that, and it speaks to the experience. It speaks more to the experience. I love that. It's beautiful.
And I was trying to portray that haunted synchronistic cloud. What was I just interviewed Eric Wargo, and he used the term synchronicity storm.
Yeah.
Like I wanted to, because I know what it feels like to be trapped in that, and I wanted the main character was trapped in that, and that I wanted to express the strangeness of that, and how urgent it felt, and how deeply personal it felt, and how at many points he says, "I don't know what's going on, but it feels important."
Mm-hmm. Well, and that, being let out to the desert, it's funny you mentioned, my time in Arizona, because that was one of that idea of just walking out, So we moved to Arizona when I was 7, and we lived there until I was 12. So I had a good 4 or 5 years of being in Arizona. At the time we moved to Glendale, it wasn't as developed as it is now. This was late 80s, early 90s. So all the development that's there now was just beginning then. So there were still these open patches of desert in the foothills of the Superstition Mountains. And I'm 14 years younger than my middle brother. So I had a way different experience with my parents than my older brothers did. A lot of which was them just being don't kill yourself, don't die. So I would just go out to the desert, so I'm this 8-year-old kid, and I would go walking, and I would just walk. And sometimes I would have friends go with me, and they would not make it. Not that they would die, but they would be it's too hot. We need water. We need whatever. And I was you should have thought about that before we went. I was this little kind of asshole trooper. Sorry. I'm not 8 years old and I'm the dad in the car. You should have thought about the bathroom trip before. Go to the bathroom before we started. And I would just keep going. They would go back, and I would just keep going, and I would just sit out there and just enjoy it. And then, come back before it got too dark, and that experience was just so formative. And that was another, that your descriptions of walking out into that resonated, because there's a mindset there that you can get into, where it's just let's just keep walking. What if we just keep walking?
And it was done sort of organically in the sense that the character doesn't really know why he's just keeping walking.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Which kind of shows up I was kind of tapping into the people who say, oh, I woke up in the middle of the night and got in my car and drove down this lonely road I'd never been on, and it turned a corner, and I don't know why I did all this. And this shows up in the UFO literature, and then a contact experience takes place. And one of the questions I would ask people because I was really nervous about the level of insecurity of putting that book out. What am I doing? The book didn't make sense to me, So how can
I remember your worries.
And so I think I was pestering not only you, but plenty of other people. I sent the book out to I think I sent it out to 8 people. Well, this is a funny little aside. I sent it out to 8 people, that book, as in a digital form. And I asked them, could you read this? Just give me some feedback on it. I sent it out to a few more, but they didn't read it. But the 8 people that read it, there was a point when this would have been in 2000, and this has been last year, 2023. And I sent a note to Kelly Chase, or she texted me or something, and she was at the Archives of the Impossible conference. That was the year I wasn't there. Mm-hmm. And she described who was sitting at the table, and I'd sent it out to 8 people. 5 of them were at the table at the conference. It was Joshua Cutchin. It was Sharon Roulette. So I was like, oh my word.
Right.
So I thought that was really funny. Oh gosh, my what a focused group, that I like. What do you think of this novel? So, and then I let me tell you, I pestered all of them when I found out people were reading it. I was like, where you at? What part you at? I was texting them like, what's going on? How's it going? And that was like totally like my own like internal like. I was so worried that like no one was going to get it, and then so yeah, that was funny. Anything else you want to add about that?
I just think that more, you had mentioned earlier Whitley's statement about write better science fiction. That was one of the reasons I was excited when you said you were putting out a novel, and Josh Cutchin put out his novel as well. More of that, I think, in this, going again back to my personal quest of like, what does this look like going forward, right? This question of what does this look like as it gets more normalized? Things like the unseen and that are going to be key to guiding people through that experience, because so much of what we have is genre fiction.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that works to a certain extent. There's a place for that. But if you look at the research on, Diana's done some of this with movies and that in media studies, but the effect of fiction on memory and the effect of fiction on perception, and Jeff's written a lot about this as well. The kind of in the supernatural too, the idea of the hypnosis and exchange that happens. When you're reading a text, you're becoming subtly hypnotized. You're entering an altered state of consciousness. When the person is writing it, they're in an altered state of consciousness, and that comes through, and you're having this weird interaction, and so things like the unseen coming from your personal experience and your knowledge, right? Because not only have you had these experiences, but you've also gone out and talked to people, and you've also gone out and collected these stories and collected these experiences and brought that together, and you've personally integrated that. And so having that then come out in a novel form where the narrative is guiding the reader through those experiences and to an end, which, it ends in a question, but it brings you through that. And I think that that's really important. It's one thing to believe, but that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about belief. We're talking about experience. And that changes things. Like, the whole society could believe in UFOs or believe in these different aspects of phenomena that occur, but they don't. Belief is different than experiencing it. And if opening these doors to the public leads from belief or to knowledge, which implies some experience of the thing itself, we need that extra step. Where does the wisdom come in, right? Where do we go from knowing that it's real because there's some sense of experiencing it, not just you've got the conceptual knowing and then you have the experiential knowing, then wisdom should come out of that, or whatever term you want to put on that third stage where it's integrated and we're using it to build a holistic, healthy culture and community and relationships, which then within this area doesn't just include human relationships, it includes relationships with a whole other sort, and so, and not just in sense of like the phenomena, but the owls, right? Like there's interactions with animals, there's interactions with other non-human intelligences that aren't just, I don't know, that are more familiar, but we don't always respect those communications.
And this is, you turn the clock back or just get in an airplane and go someplace else. Like the knowledge that there's a overriding or somewhat obscured guiding intelligence parallel to us is like, that's right. That's all over India. That's all over every culture. You go to like the Native Americans, you go to the jungles of Brazil.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Turn the clock back a couple hundred years, and the Irish farmers, were interacting with the fairies in a cooperative way, offering things to the fairies.
Well, even it's interesting. One of my like areas of scholarship is folk belief, but popular belief and popular experiences with these areas, and it's not just, we don't even have to go back that far. I mean, grab your old Farmer's Almanac. You can go down to any grocery store. Sometimes gas stations will have them, depending on where you're at. But go get a Farmer's Almanac and open up the back. In the classified ads, there's going to be whole sections on hiring psychics. And that's not a throwback. That's a contemporary thing, and it's not tied to parapsychology. These aren't, and I'm not saying that they're necessarily legitimate psychic counselors, but the idea that exists, right? Like the fact that there's enough of a market there where people are interacting with that. And when people are interacting with that, they're also interacting whether or not that, psychic who's offering services is legitimately psychic and offering some sort of connection to the actual thing itself. The fact that people are interacting with that in a way, they're interacting with the possibility of that thing in their life, and it's not a hidden thing. There's on Facebook, I'm part of a Georgia folk and farm life group, just to kind of, I'm from Chicago, so it's nice to have something to continue to integrate me with the culture that I'm living in the region. And there's stories about people still planting by the moon, right? And this is contemporary. Like this isn't just my grandfather did it. There was some of that. Like, oh yeah, I remember when my grandfather did that. My dad used to do that. My grandma used to, she would collect herbs at a certain time or whatever. But then there were other people coming in being like, oh yeah, that's how I plant. I'm not talking about like gardens either. These are people who are farming, and so they're right. They're either in industrial agriculture or they're they're in that border between independent farmers and industrial agriculture, and they're still using, planting by the moon and planting by the astrological signs, which again is in the Old Farmer's Almanac. So these are contemporary beliefs, but the weird thing is they don't cross over into what we're shown in the mainstream. In the wider sense of what our culture is, that stuff's not really talked about. And it's been kind of, we were talking about academia entering these areas. One of the weirdest things to me is when the academic idea of, rediscovering this lost knowledge, and they'll go back and be like, oh, in the 30s they were doing this stuff. And I'm like, I live in rural Georgia. Like, you're just, like nobody's dressing up and you're not going to, you're not going to find a folk magic practitioner by looking for the person with a pentagram and being Wiccan or something. You need to go to a church because this is a lived experience. And these people, that they go to church. And all the people that I've met who practice folk magic they've been conservative Christians. They just also happen to talk out the fire and, do blood stopping, right? Do laying on of hands and healing, doing, impromptu exorcisms against evil spirits and stuff like that. They believe in ghosts and all the rest of it. So they experience ghosts, experience apparitional phenomena and all the rest of it. All the things that you would associate with that, but they live it, but they don't talk about it in the same way because they're not, I'm not trying to like other this, but it's not. They're not coming from the paranormal subcultures, right? They're coming from a lived experience of just being an average person, living their lives in Christianity and doing whatever, but there's this added component of this experiential level of magic, what the rest of the culture would call magic. They don't use the same terms, there was I met a guy when I first moved down here. He was a cook at a restaurant next door to the place I was renting. And I'd be going to my car, walking out in the back alley, and I'd always see him, and we'd say hi or whatever. And one day we got talking, and he asked me what I did. And when I first moved down to Georgia, I was kind of weird because, my middle brother had worked with Pat Robertson and had actually worked with the Southern Baptist Convention and stuff like that. So I was used to, I knew what my interests and everything could turn into if I talked to the wrong person in the wrong way. It could ostracize me, or it could be bad. So I didn't want to talk about it with people where I was living and that. I didn't want to witch hunt, which is possible. It can happen. You can end up on the wrong end of that. So talking to this cook, he was like, "What do you do?" And I was like, "Oh, I don't really want to say," and I was like, "Well, I write about weird stuff." And he was like, "Oh, what kind of weird stuff?" And I was like, "How do I frame this in a way that is not going to get me?" How am I going to frame this so that it's going to sound normal? So I was like, well, like ghost hunting shows or ancient aliens, I write about that from a scholarly perspective. And he looked at me and he goes, people, they don't believe in that stuff. And he's like, because you can't see it. He's like, I believe in God and I can't see God. And I know that other side is real as well. So I understand what you're saying. And I was like, oh, whoa, that's kind of a deep answer. That was a really heartfelt answer. Not only was he like, oh yeah, I watched those shows or something. He was like, no, I'm living in this. You know, I was like, okay. So it turned out it was because his dad had been a traditional healer and had been born with a caul.
Mm-hmm. Oh, the caul over his face.
Yeah, born with a caul over his face, and had been a traditional healer in Atlanta. And he'd not only, he'd practiced second sight. So if you felt your house was haunted, you would call him, and he would come and tell you, and he would get rid of this. Is in like the 60s and 70s and stuff. He would do healing. He healed thrush. So it's a fungal infection that gets in infants and was a major problem. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the areas of traditional healing that happens. So he would heal thrush. So he's telling me all these stories, and, stories about ghost spotting, where he had this one experience where he and his dad were at a bus stop, and they were waiting for the bus, and the bus stop across the street, bus comes, and before this all happens, his dad's sitting there with him, and he goes, you see that guy standing there with his back to us? And the guy was like, yeah. And he's like, that guy's not alive, that's a ghost. And this guy was like, okay, Dad, whatever. And he's like, no, trust me, watch. When the bus comes, you will see everybody get on. That person that we see the back of will not get on the bus, and he won't be there. Bus comes. They watch, kids counting, all the people that are at the bus stop get on. That guy doesn't get on. Bus leaves, that guy's not there. And he was like, oh, okay. So he was living in this reality, right? It was so interesting to me because I had a friend come over, and the friend, I told him about Preston, this guy. And my friend was all excited. He was like, oh, I want to meet this, this magic guy, whatever, And so he starts like talking about like psalm magic, and I don't know, he started basically like what you would get on like a, like contemporary culture kind of thing, right? Like he's like, oh, your dad, did he do psalm magic? Was he doing conjure? Like, was he blah, blah, blah? And Preston looked at him and was just like, I don't know what you're talking about. And that was it. He was done, right? Me and Preston could talk about all this stuff like openly, but the second it was named, Preston was like, that's not it. That's not what's going on. This isn't conjure, whatever you want, hoodoo, whatever. He's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And it was really eye-opening to me, because that is kind of how I feel with this stuff. And I think what your book captures is like, and again, this idea of UFOs not in it, right? And that is the true experience. It's, it's not, it doesn't have a name, it's not named. And if you can embrace that ambiguity, I think you're a lot better off, especially going forward. And that's something that people get frustrated with, the way the government and military stuff is going right now, because they're cutting out like we're not going to read any of that stuff, and like, let's just go from where we're at. But in a way that, there's a necessity for that fresh start, because we have a lot of sort of fictional narratives that have arranged themselves around this topic that don't fit the actual experience. And then that makes it even weirder when you have the actual experiences and you're like, well, this doesn't fit what I saw, this doesn't fit the thing that I thought it would be.
Exactly. I think just on a very simplistic level, we live in this Western mechanized society, but if you buy a plot of land and you want to put a well on there, like the guy who digs the well is going to call some old man who's been in the town forever, and he's going to come out with a hickory stick and walk in circles and point and say, dig the well there. And that's how it's always done.
That's exactly it. And, people hearing this who are not in an area or have not dealt with digging a well may not believe that, but it is absolutely true. The property owner at the first property that I was talking about, where the owl experiences and everything happened, property owner was an adamant NPR, science-only atheist. Had no truck with anything, he didn't like religion, he didn't like anything related to any of this stuff. Completely, purely science, logic, and the rest of it. When he had the well dug, he had a dowser come out and do and get the thing. And it was part of the service offered by the well digging company. And I asked, I was like, but you're not, like, you have no space for any. You'll get angry and start ranting about this stuff. It was like being around James Randi, and it was just like,
yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
But you're cool with the dowsing. And he was like, well, it works. And I'm like, well, okay, I'll give you that. All right, that makes sense. But yeah, I mean, it was amazing, and that's super prevalent. One of the folks down here, I actually have a video up on YouTube of an interview with him talking about his, I believe it was his, like, I think it was his uncle, but a relative of his who'd been a traditional healer. His family ran a well digging company, and that was part of the thing too, like dowsing. It's just there.
Exactly. Yeah. And I often say, people will say like, well, we don't have a model for this kind of weirdness. And I'm like, of course we do. It's fiction.
Right.
Right? Like, go scroll through Netflix, and like how many shows are about the little town where like the witch lives and doesn't want to, or like the vampires or the people who are the psychic who's tortured and, like with his own abilities. And yeah, it's like,
yeah.
I wrote this book, and it's kind of like, oh God, how this book is totally weird. And then I like went on to a Barnes and Noble and went to the paranormal romance aisle, and I'm like, oh no, my book is like tame compared to some of the stuff that's out there. So, or the majority, and it's like a huge genre thing. So it's like people are steeped in this, but it's in the box of fiction. It's like, they sit, they do their, they work at the office all day, and then they sit in front of the TV and watch paranormal trippy, Netflix series. I mean, there's a series called Outer Range. It's on Amazon Prime.
Oh, I saw an ad.
Oh wow, yep. It's like however weird my book is, this show is 10 times weirder. And it's great. I mean, but it's doing exactly that. It's trying to capture this elusive mood.
Yeah.
And I think just tapping into that elusive mood has a kind of magic power to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
David, this has been great. We've been going at it for coming on 2 hours now, and there's plenty of stuff I know we could get to. I got a long list of things that we never got to, but this has been wonderful. So how do people find you online if they want to reach out?
davidmetcalfe.wordpress.com is my blog. And most of my stuff is connected through there. I'm on Instagram as Liminal Analytics, and on Twitter and other things as David B. Metcalfe.
Wonderful.
So
this has been a delight. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I'm so glad that we finally, we had breakfast with Valet, and now we've had a great conversation. So this is good.
Good. I'm looking forward to carrying this on at some point. I feel like we just scratched the surface of this stuff. So. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
This is Mike, and I am chiming in at the end of the editing. I really did not know David at all before this conversation, and he is, in many ways, the perfect guest for my podcast, for this show, because his ideas align so cleanly with many of my ideas on the source of this mystery and the role it seems to be playing in the lives of people who have had the direct experience, or who have had, let's say, a peripheral experience. It still has a powerful impact on people and their lives. Once again, if you would like to pledge your support, you can do so through my Patreon site, and you can also do it through Buy Me a Coffee and just search out Mike Cleland. I'll come right up. And there will be a day when I will get some formal intro and outro music. I simply haven't done that yet, but I foresee a day when there will be some music. My old Hidden Experience show, starting back in 2009, never had music. All it had was an occasional little chime as a little bumper to show the segues between sections, and essentially that's what I'm doing now. That's what that funny little organ piece is. Here, I'll do it for you right now. Here's the organ bit. There, that's the extent of my music so far. I'm content with that, but I foresee a day when I'll go a step further. Peace and strength, and thank you. Bye now. What you just listened to was the YouTube version of the Hidden Experience audio podcast. This show is hosted by Mike Cleland, and that's me, and it is available on most of the popular podcast platforms. Just search out Hidden Experience Audio. And if you want to support the show, you can find it on Patreon, as well as Buy Me a Coffee. This YouTube version has ads, but the audio version is always ad-free. And you can also join my YouTube channel here. Thank you so much for listening, and please support this show.